Hello and welcome back to the port. I'm the Gav Major and this is a review and summary of the Italian tech tree cruisers. Now this is going to be a broad brush review and summary of them, and it's going to be focusing on covering tiers 4 to tier 7. The idea behind that is that tiers 4 to tier 7 is the tiers that a majority of players are going to sit at and play. Tier 5 is a good money making tier for these cruisers. We've had seasons of ranked in tiers 4, 5 and 6, and the tier 7 is always nice to know what the gem of the tech tree or the end goal of the tech tree is like. Now, as part of this review and summary, we will be going for a couple of topics. The first topic will be traits. Now this is where we look at the general traits of the cruisers in each of the subcategories. That's survivability, artillery, torpedoes, maneuverability, concealment and consumables. But it's a very broad brush, so I'm going to be looking at all of the cruisers from tiers 4 to tier 7 in the Italian cruiser tech tree. So if you want a more in-depth review of each individual cruiser, then I'd highly recommend the Italian cruiser review playlist, which will be carded top right now. We'll also take a look into the commanders. We'll take a brief look at the commanders and what they offer, what base skills they have, what unique skills they have, and yeah, just look at what they kind of can do for us. We'll also look at play styles. Basically, that's how do these cruisers play? Are they very similar to some other nations, or are they very unique in the way they're played? We'll also take a summary. This is where we then look at the previous categories, that's playstyles, commanders and traits, and we'll just see what we can kind of derive from that, and just summarising it all together. I'll then also do a tech tree ranking. This is basically how I would rank this tech tree in standard and ranked play, but obviously that's going to be partially based on some of my own opinions, therefore do take it with a pinch of salt if it doesn't quite match up with your personal feelings. And then finally, there's a category called How Would I Improve It? Basically, if there's anything to improve this tech tree, what would I do? Sometimes that could be I say I wouldn't change anything, and other times it could be I'll change everything. And as I've said, some of this is based off my own opinion, so your mileage may vary and your own experiences may vary. But I think we should crack on and jump into the first category. So, traits of the Italian tech tree cruisers. Well, let's start off with survivability. From tiers 5 to 7, they have a very high amount of HP or hit points. When it comes to torpedo reduction, they have the best or the joint best torpedo reduction at their individual tiers. Going into artillery, from tiers 5 to tier 7, they have 8-inch guns. Now they have a below average gun count at each tier. They have a very good 8-inch shell damage qualities, however they have very poor 6-inch shell qualities. So that's basically the high explosive damage, the AP damage and the fire chance of their shells. Now for some reason the 6-inch guns in the Italian cruisers aren't that impressive, but when you get to the 8-inch guns they're actually quite nice. However, they do have a slow reload time. What this means is you end up with having quite a low DPM for your high explosives and your armor piercing rounds, and also you have a very low fires per minute. Fires per minute is statistically how many fires you could set with this, with your cruiser if you fired all your guns as quickly as you could over the course of a minute. Torpedoes. Always got one launcher per side, which is quite nice. Now these torpedoes are fast reloading per tube. However, the launcher reload time varies depending on how many tubes there are per launcher. So your actual torpedo launcher reload time at each individual tier is kind of all over the shop. Torpedoes are the slowest and they have the shortest detectability. So there's two interesting traits there, and we'll come back to those when we look into the summary. The torpedoes have a very long range. They have a lot of touching distance, and this is another kind of nice trait with this tech tree. However, your torpedoes have a small torpedo warhead, which means they're not going to do a lot of damage, and the chance of actually causing flooding if they hit the torpedo bulge of an enemy ship is actually reduced. Maneuverability. You have a good speed at all tiers apart from tier 6 where you have an average speed, so generally these are quite nippy cruisers. You always have a small turning circle, but you do have a slow rudder shift, so that's something to take into account. Concealment, as you should know already, based on their traits of being hidden, these have great concealment at all tiers. Consumables, now this is a little bit interesting. Obviously, they now have exhaust smoke consumable. This has a 17-second dispersion and a 27-second duration and a 240-second reload. The nice thing about the exhaust smoke screen is it keeps up with your cruiser. So if your cruiser's doing 37, 38, 39 knots and you hit this consumable, your cruiser will be hidden in smoke for 17 seconds while it's still travelling at its full speed. Now, you don't come with any sonar or radar in this tech tree, so that's a bit of a swings and roundabouts thing. It depends on which tier you're at and also how critical that is to your playstyle, but it's something to bear in mind. You're not going to be getting any of that with these cruisers. Now you do have catapult fighters, that's quite nice. However, the downside is these fighters have the worst damage per second. Commanders, well, that's Cinzanetti and Mirabelli. Both have access to reasonable base traits. So Mirabelli gives you an improved cruiser main battery reload speed, quite a nice trait. Sanzanetti gives you a reduced incoming damage to cruisers, again a very nice ability. I don't see that one being one that I'd use as an inspiration personally, but I think it's still a very good trait and I can see some people maybe considering that as an inspiration. Now going through their skills, they mostly have generic skills, very similar to every other nation. You've got one offensive commander and one defensive commander, with offensive and defensive traits mostly assigned to those offensive and defensive commanders. So if you have a comfort zone when you play cruisers, say you always like to have refill station on your commander, then that is available. If you always like to have the ingenious ability, that is available. So there is a nice little bit of comfort zone. So if you play cruisers a lot, you're going to be very easy. You're going to know which commander you want straight off the bat. Now they both have a unique ability, which do affect the play style, and so it's interesting to see. On Sanzanetti, you can turn your armor piercing into semi-armor piercing. What this means is you shorten the fuse time of your armor piercing shells, so they will penetrate after they detonate after penetrating thinner armor or thinner amounts of armor. However, you do improve the damage, so it's going to pack a bit more punch. However, it does affect the accuracy of your shells, so that's something to consider. With Mirabelli, you can reduce the detectability of your torpedoes and increase their speed. However, you do have to take a reduction of their range, and that's quite a significant reduction. So the playstyle of these Italian cruisers. Don't let the exhaust smoke screen trick you into thinking they play like British cruisers. They very much don't. These cruisers are very much like other nations, like the American heavy cruisers, like the Japanese cruisers, like the French cruisers and the Russian cruisers. These cruisers are very much about keeping moving or getting behind an island and shooting over it. Very much like everyone else. Keeping a range against battleships is a very advisable thing. You need as much time as possible to react to incoming volleys, and with your slow rudder shift, keeping at range gives you more time to respond to the incoming shots. I'd always probably highly recommend rudder shift modules and rudder shift skills on your commanders. Increase that rudder shift gives you more flexibility in being able to turn out and dodge enemy shots. Playing at range, I think, is also another reason why the torpedo ranges are quite long. It's kind of like the torpedo ranges go hand in hand with the playstyle of keeping at range. And personally, I like to keep firing these torpedoes out as aerial denial. It doesn't matter if you're not actually selecting a target. If you know enemies are going to be moving to an objective, possibly going through a choke point or in the general vicinity, you might as well fire them out, because the reload time is reasonable on these anyway, and also just getting them out there because they keep going for so long. Like some people call them, they're like sneaky little sea mines. Now the AP is very good on these cruisers, so if you can catch an enemy cruiser that's broadside on, feel free to try and get that citadel and punch that broadside. However, if you switch to semi-armor piercing, then this is going to change that. So the idea of semi-armor piercing in general is you aim for thinner armor on enemy ships. Because these shells are going to only want to go through thin armor, you're going to be aiming at things like the bow, the stern, the superstructure, trying to get penetrations on there where you're going to be able to get the damage. If you aim for thicker armor, your shells are just going to shatter. One thing to note regarding the playstyle of these cruisers is they don't have sonar, so this means you're going to have to be on your toes if you do decide to sit in a smokescreen or stay within the same location. If you know there's destroyers in the area, take that into account. Nice thing about cruisers is usually you are quite difficult to torpedo if you're moving, because you're going to be constantly turning and basically moving is the best way to put it. However, if you are going to be one of those who likes to sit in the smokescreen or sit behind an island, it might be potentially worthwhile, say, looking up propulsion modules and maybe any kind of torpedo detection skills that you can get on your commanders. Now, this is kind of where the aircraft kind of comes in as well. I like to use the aircraft as my local sonar, using it to try and spot torpedoes, but always bear in mind that your aircraft will normally lose dogfights versus other nations. So if you get in close to an area where there's enemy aircraft, expect yours to get shot down first. So on to the summary. I find these cruisers are on par with their counterparts at their tiers. The lower tiers, tier 2, tier 3 and tier 4, I kind of feel they're a bit weak, but the tech tree definitely takes a massive swing for the better at tier 5 and up. I find from the tier 5 and up, these cruisers are very rewarding, especially in a good cruiser commander's hands. I find that they bring some interesting new abilities and some quirky traits, making them slightly different to some of the other nations, but some of the playstyle elements are very similar. Now, their low DPM does sometimes mean that these cruisers are more like long or slow burners, I should say, meaning that they will get more out of a longer game than a shorter game. So that's just something to take into account. But then again, everyone's going to get more in the longer game. It just means in the short term, you can find yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage. But as the game plays out, you can find yourself getting some really nice scores. Now, regarding the unique skills of the commanders, I don't think these are actually special enough. I did do some testing, and in both cases, I kind of felt like, yeah, it's all right, but I'd rather not have it and have something else. So firstly, I don't think swapping armor piercing to semi-armor piercing is worthwhile. Semi-armor piercing is pretty much the same tool as high explosives, so they're both about penetrating thinly armored parts of a ship and detonating behind it. So the semi-armor piercing does mean that you can punch through bows and sterns and superstructures, but with high explosives, that will detonate on the outside unless it's a really thin piece of plating. But the benefit of high explosives is it will set a fire, and if it does hit thick armor, the high explosive still detonates and causes damage to ship modules around it, whereas the semi-armor piercing is just going to crump up and it's either going to be deflected or it's going to shatter. And I think because the armor piercing is quite good in these cruisers, I feel like taking that away from these cruisers just to have another similar ammunition type to high explosives, which they already have, doesn't feel worthwhile. I try to think of it as like tools in my toolbox. Armor piercing is a hammer, it's very good at putting nails in. High explosives is like a flat blade screwdriver. You can put in flathead screws and crosshead screws if you know what you're doing. I feel like semi-armor piercing is a crosshead or a Phillips kind of screwdriver. It's very particular for putting in that type of screw, but I could still put that screw in my flat blade, and so I'd rather have a hammer and a flat blade screwdriver, because then I can put nails and screws in, then 2 screwdrivers, which mean I can put in 2 different types of screw, but I could probably do that anyway with my hammer and the flat blade screwdriver combo. That's how I always try and look at this. I always try and look at it as, what's the tools in my box? I'd rather have more tools in my box, or different tools for different jobs in my box, rather than similar tools for the same job. The other unique skill where it reduces the torpedo detectability and increases their speed is actually on the face of it there, just those 2 abilities. That is really nice, because that means your torpedoes are super sneaky, and then when they do get spotted, the enemy don't have a lot of time to respond to it, and more than likely, if it's lined up as a hit, it's going to be a hit. However, I don't like the massive drop in range. It might suit players who like to get in close, because if you get in close, I guess with the increased speed, how much you have to lead the ship is going to be reduced, and then with their reduced detectability, it means those torpedoes are going to get there and they're going to have less time to respond to it. However, they're still not going to be super fast, and so it's one of those kind of situations when if you see a cruiser go kind of broadside on in close range, you know what they're doing. They're trying to get torpedoes out, so you know you can dodge. So whether it's enough to make that playstyle useful is another question, but it doesn't suit my playstyle. I like to stand off and stay at range with these cruisers, and so I like the long range torpedoes. I like that touching distance of getting them out there. Now, going on to the exhaust smoke screens, I think these are actually a great way to drop off detectability when you need to show broadside to the enemy. Examples are being like when you're passing between gaps and islands at close range, when you're turning away from an engagement, or if you're pinned against an island and you can't turn away because it's an island, but you don't want to turn in because you're heading off to, say, an objective or an area, and you've got something off to your side that is causing you a little bit of bother. Being able just to drop off for 17 seconds, surviving that little bit longer sometimes, can be very nice. However, the exhaust smoke screen can be used as a short duration sitting smoke screen should you wish, so it's there as an option. I wouldn't say this is the main purpose of this smoke screen, but if you need it, you can use it that way. And it's actually quite good for, say, capturing an objective while unseen, because if you pop this exhaust smoke screen, it will last for 57 seconds. So if you are capturing the standard domination capture zone, you should be able to do it mostly obscured. Now, the torpedoes, I think on these, they got some very interesting skills. So first of all, they have a very short detectability range and a slow speed. Let's ignore the range for now. So what this means is your torpedoes, if they get detected at their detectability range, right, the enemy will have the least amount of time to respond to these torpedoes in comparison to other nations, simply because that detectability is so short. However, if these torpedoes are spotted by sonar, by an aircraft, possibly could have been spotted by a ship in the area that's not your target, then the enemy's going to have the most amount of time to respond to these torpedoes because they're so slow. So it's really a swings and roundabouts things with this. Now their range, I like their range, being able to chuck them out of range, and I like to use them as aerial denial. So I feel that at the longest range, it doesn't matter whether you fire it out as narrow spread or wide spread, because the gaps between the torpedoes are going to be massive regardless what you do. Secondly, I don't think there's any reason why you have to cross out widespread. I still think widespread is a good way of causing aerial denial. It means you're spreading your torpedoes over a large area, but with these torpedoes, if they're spotted, they're going to miss or hit regardless. If they're spotted by sonar, they're going to miss regardless. If they're spotted at the closest range, if it's a hit, it's a hit. I mean, the enemy's not going to have a lot of time to respond to these torpedoes. So whether or not there's a big gap between that and the next torpedo really doesn't matter. Now, continuing on to the summary, I think this has been a bit of a poor release by Wargaming, with only releasing them with normal smoke. And the other one was like the strange turret angles that we had on the tier 3. I kind of wish they simply sat on these a little longer and released them either in this patch in October or the next patch in November. I feel like these cruisers just needed a little bit more polish. I mean, we've got there in the end by them fixing the smokescreen, but I kind of feel like we should have avoided an incomplete release, and I kind of hope they avoid doing incomplete releases in future. I'd rather wait and have something that's more polished than something that's rushed out a little too early. This kind of doesn't bode well for carriers, but then again, this is a one-off, so maybe this is just the one mess up. It's probably been due to COVID, which has meant that development times and lead times have been slowed down. I think it's one of the reasons why the Bureau has been so neglected recently, which then makes me think, well, did they rush the Bureau out too early? But then again, I guess you can't really predict the kind of environments that are going to be happening, and if you end up with longer lead times than expected, I think you just need to be honest with the audience. And I think a bit of honesty would be nice at the moment. Something saying, sorry about the Bureau, there's nothing coming this patch, but we do have something planned in future. We can't give you a release date as yet. Just something just to let us know, because it does seem a bit empty at the moment. Anyway, the Italians do have some good commanders, and they do offer up lots of flexibility. They've got some really nice base traits that I will personally be using as inspirations on other nations. They have some strange, unique skills, but I think that's a playstyle thing. Personally, I don't think they're worthwhile. However, your mileage may vary. So the tech tree ranking, basically ranking them in kind of gameplays. First of all, let's cover off ranked. So how would I rank these cruisers for playing in ranked? Now, I think here I'm going to have to break it down into the actual individual tiers, just simply because the individuality of those cruisers, and then also how different those tiers of ranked are. Now, so that means I'm going to be covering the tier 4, the tier 5 and tier 6. I won't cover the tier 7 because as yet we haven't had any kind of hint that there's going to be a tier 7 ranked coming anytime soon, and we haven't had one as yet. So starting off with tier 4, the Montecuccoli, she's not the strongest cruiser, and I'd say she's rather subpar for the tier. I'd put her on the same level as the Emerald in my personal choice. I think at tier 4, if you want to play a cruiser, I think the Kirov, Veritaka, Omaha, and the Emily Batin are going to be very good cruisers. I think the French tier 4 is going to be where I go when it comes to tier 4 cruisers. So for tier 5, I can see them being as common as the other nations. And I think at tier 5, we have a lot of variation cruisers. We got the Aoba, the Pensacola, the Leander, the Le Gazinière, the Bedoini. So I think there might be some more, but I think we have a good variety of cruisers there, and I think they all have decent purposes. So when it comes to tier 5 ranked, I think we can see some Italian cruisers turn up. I think we can see them doing some lifting like the rest of them. Now at tier 6, I think they'll be common enough, but I think their lack of sonar and radar will be felt here, which does slightly remove their utility. At tier 6 ranked, you do see a lot more radar cruisers being brought into the mix, and I think that's obviously inherent because it's basically a form of domination, and destroyers are actually quite crucial to a team, especially considering they're limited to only 2 per side. Now, in standard battle, I think we should expect to see them as often as the other nations, and I personally found them really enjoyable. Overall, I'd say they're a great addition to the game once we got there with the exhaust smoke, and they offer a new playstyle to the game, which I do find quite enjoyable. I know I'm repeating myself, but I really do like these. Um, does it mean I'm going to stop playing British cruisers? No, no. British cruisers is going to be my bread and butter, but these Italian cruisers have been quite enjoyable, and I'm probably going to play them just as much as some of the other nations. So, how would I improve them? Well, personally, I don't think they need any real improvement as yet in the current environment and meta. However, that could be due to my commander build and the modules that I have used on these cruisers, and I'll cover that in the next bullet point almost. So I think in the long run, the main battery reload could maybe be reduced a little bit in order to try and improve the DPM of these cruisers. If Wargaming find that the uptake of these cruisers isn't high, but I think there's enough tools there for people to play around with their commanders, play around with the inspirations, play around with their ship modules in order to do their own minor tweaking. I guess the other element of these cruisers that might get tweaked in the future would be their rudder shift. So going on to why I don't think they need an improvement, and that's because of my command build and modules. I always go for as many steering modules as possible. I think getting that rudder shift down is pretty critical to them. Now obviously some of you may decide to go for propulsion modules or some of the other modules instead of the double steering gear or single steering gear depending on your tier. But I think steering gear, that's where you want to go. And then we go on to my commander build, and this is I've gone for a maximum reload speed commander build on these cruisers. So I'm using Sanzanetti and I'm using the refill station legendary trait, and then I'm inspiring him with Madden and Milibelli in order to try and maximize my rate of fire and improve my DPM. And I haven't got any flaws or any faults with my commander build. I think it suits my playstyle very well. So it obviously your mileage may vary. You might choose a different type of commander build, but I kind of felt that the maximum reload speed kind of build on the cruiser did work for me. However, because I've had to go for maximum reload speed on my cruiser commander, does that mean there's an issue with the actual reload speed in game? Because obviously, if they did decrease the reload speed, would I change my commander build on these cruisers? Possibly, possibly not. Maybe if they reduce the reload time of the main battery, I might swap out, say, one of the commander's inspirations to Mikoaf or Concealment, just to try and buff that out. Or maybe using the Azure Lane Belfast commander for reduced firing and smoke. I mean, I think, yeah, if they reduce the reload speed, I might switch my commander around. However, I think with that kind of commander build, these cruisers work for me. Well, that's all, folks. As I said at the start, this is a very broad brush approach, so you may not completely agree with everything I've said, and some of it is based on my own opinions. So again, my opinion will possibly differ from yours. However, this is just like a little view into my head and what I thought of them. Um, Obviously, you can share your own personal thoughts down in the comments. That's perfectly fine by me. And as always, I try and respond to all comments where I can. And if you've enjoyed this, or even if you haven't enjoyed it, but if you can kind of appreciate some of the points that I'm trying to put across, I may not be right in your own minds, but at least I'm trying to justify myself in some form of way. Feel free to give the video a thumbs up. If you enjoy these kind of summaries and content, feel free to check out some of the other content on the channel, and feel free to subscribe if you are not already subscribed. And if you are already a subscriber, I say thank you very much, guys, for your continued support, comments and contributions towards the channel. As always, down in the description will be the email address for the channel should you wish to send in any of your own game captures. Do you have any game captures of your own of you playing in these Italian cruisers? Have you had any great games that you'd like to submit for Avenue Reports where it's your gameplay of my commentary? Or have you had some awkward games or terrible games in these cruisers and you're just not quite sure what to do? then feel free to send those in as well, and we can do a tactical overlay of them on sea trials and try and highlight some of the alternative things that you could possibly do with your gameplay. But also, if you've got a really good game, another good reason for sea trials, because then I can showcase your gameplay to other players, showing what you're doing right as you're going through. Also, if you'd like to support the channel on Patreon, then that's available down in the description. Obviously, your support is much welcomed, but it's not compulsory, and this channel is non-monetized and will stay non-monetized, so you won't see any adverts, and it's basically fully financed by myself. However, if you want to assist, you can always chip in on Patreon. Well, until next time, I'm the Galloping Major, and back to the port.